Anderson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's a delight to welcome you here to our Calabasas campus for this afternoon's conference titled Revisiting Broken Windows, Connecting Theory to Policy for America's Public Safety. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure to thank the organization that is not only making today possible, but has just been so fun to work with in organizing panels, thinking through the agenda for this conference. You see them noted here on the agenda, but to call them out specifically, I want to thank Howard Amundsen and Fieldstead. Please join me in thanking them for making today possible. I have to say with Fieldstead and with Howard, who's just so incredibly well-read and well-connected, that it's a joy to think through these conferences that we've had a chance to do with you, Howard, and your team, with TJ and Scott and Paula back in Orange County. Several of the panelists who are going to be speaking here today are not people that I knew of before organizing this conference. They're people that are in your world. So I'm so glad for this opportunity to collaborate with you all. Again, the title of this event is Revisiting Broken Windows, and that, of course, is an ode to a theory that was propounded by one James Q. Wilson and his colleague and friend George Kelling back in the early 80s. This is particularly important for us at the School of Public Policy because Dr. Wilson was really such an important part of essentially designing the school itself. Last year we celebrated our 25th anniversary year, and it gave us an opportunity to look back over the various influences on the School of Public Policy from our founding in 1997 through to today. And in that, looking at the influence and impact of James Q. Wilson has been really such a joy. Wilson started as one of our founding faculty. He served as our Ronald Reagan visiting professor for most of the last dozen years of his life. But as importantly, he was part of the Blue Ribbon Committee that was organized by then Pepperdine University president David Davenport, that was brought together back in the mid-90s when they were exploring the launch of this new School of Public Policy. It was Wilson coming to California initially for a position he had accepted at UCLA, but happened to make his home with his wife in Malibu, and learning that the great Dr. Wilson was living in Malibu, the president reached out to say, hey, we're looking to start a new policy school. It'd be great to have you participate in helping us design the curriculum. It was shortly after he had just penned and published his very important book, The Moral Sense. And both that experience as well as his experience at Harvard's Kennedy School really influenced the design of our curriculum, which includes not just the quantitative elements of policy analysis, which you'll see in a lot of these Masters in Public Policy programs, but also the qualitative aspects. It was Wilson's belief that understanding the history and culture, the cultural context in which you're working, is as important, if not more important, than some of the analytical pieces. That understanding the quantitative aspects are vitally important, but you also have to know that a policy that's going to work in Calabasas is not going to work in New York City or Santa Monica or even Westlake Village. And while we understand that intuitively, like so many things Dr. Wilson discussed, including his broken windows theory, we understand that intuitively it's important that we then think, research, and quantify those assumptions. And that's, again, something that Dr. Wilson did so well. His piece, Broken Windows, with George, was in the March 1982 issue of The Atlantic. And I just wanted to quickly quote from the conclusion of this piece. because I think it speaks to the work that we do at the policy school, but also the moment that we're in. Rereading this 20-something page piece that Wilson and Kelling wrote just over 40 years ago, it's so interesting to see the Wilson approach to a variety of public policy issues, but in this case crime, that it wasn't simply about the individual, nor was it about the municipality, it was about the community. It was about the neighborhood. What was going on in the neighborhood? And to understand that even within a city, even drilling down to that level, what was happening on the east side of town versus the west side of town could be different. And so the policy responses, especially through public safety, were going to have to be different as well. So I just wanted to read these before introducing our speaker, our keynote speaker for the lunch, here in that broken windows piece. But the most important requirement is to think that to maintain order in precarious situations is a vital job. The police know this is one of their functions, and they also believe correctly that it cannot be done to the exclusion of criminal investigation and responding to calls. We may have encouraged them to suppose, however, on the basis of our oft-repeated concerns about serious violent crime, that they will be judged exclusively on their capacity as crime fighters. To the extent that this is the case, police administrators will continue to concentrate police personnel in the highest crime areas, though not necessarily in the areas most vulnerable to criminal invasion. Emphasize their training in the law and criminal apprehension, and join too quickly in campaigns to decriminalize harmless behavior. Above all, we must return to our long abandoned view that the police ought to protect communities as well as individuals. Our crime statistics and victimization surveys measure individual losses, but they do not measure communal losses. Just as physicians now recognize the importance of fostering health rather than simply treating illness, so the police and the rest of us ought to recognize the importance of maintaining intact communities without broken windows. So as we look at the agenda for this afternoon's seminar, we're going to begin with our lunch and keynote address from Rafael Mangual. We will then move on to a pair of panels exploring the arguments of Wilson, but also more broadly public safety issues here in California and around the country. And then we're going to include a keynote conversation between myself and Stephen Tellis, who knew Dr. Wilson, but also this understanding, this debate around how we apply theories to actual public policy issues. How do you go from the ivory tower into the streets? I'm sure we're going to see today through the panels and our keynote that there have been pendulum swings even in the understanding of broken windows theory. And those pendulum swings have had real impacts on the safety of our communities. How do we best do that? So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our keynote address given by Rafael Mangual, the Fellow and Head of Research for Policing and Public Safety at the Manhattan Institute.
Well, I want to start by thanking you all for coming and thanking Dean Peterson and the School of Public Policy for putting this conference on and for extending an invitation to me to speak. So I'm going to get right into the substance of my remarks. More than 40 years have passed since the publication of what turned out to be one of the most important essays ever written. Its two-word title perfectly captured the essence of what the essay conveyed, which was a seemingly simple but deeply insightful idea. Public order matters. Of course, there was more to it than that. Public disorder signals to the public that no one is in charge of a public space, such that visible signs of disorder were essentially processed by community members as warnings. You're not safe here. And if left unaddressed, those signs of disorder left those spaces more vulnerable to further disorder and even serious crime. Quote, "If a window in a building is broken and left unrepaired, all the rest of the windows will soon be broken." That was written by the late James Q. Wilson and longtime Manhattan Institute senior fellow George L. Kelling in their seminal 1982 article in the Atlantic Monthly. They went on, "Unintended behavior leads to the breakdown of community controls and causes residents to, quote, think that crime, especially violent crime, is on the rise and modify their behavior accordingly. The areas in which disorder is allowed to fester, they can become more vulnerable to criminal invasion, as they put it, particularly when compared to places where people are confident that they can regulate public behavior through informal controls." Now, these are the ideas which were expounded on by Kelly and his wife, Catherine Coles, in their 1996 book, Fixing Broken Windows, that sparked a revolution in American policing. And at the direction of bold police executives like NYPD Commissioner and LAPD Chief Bill Bratton, police departments across the country would soon, through the 1990s and 2000s, adopt tactics and strategies that reflected these important insights. Sweating the small stuff also yielded unexpected fruit, it turned out, such as the illegal firearms discovered during pat-downs of turnstile jumpers in the subways, and the open warrants discovered during the enforcement of open container violations on the street. And the concurrent and sharp decline in crime that occurred as what became known as broken windows policing grew more common, solidified legend status for Kelling and Wilson. But it also sparked increasingly acrimonious pushback from anti-police academics and activists. And part of what made the debates about broken windows so contentious was that the term took on a life of its own, meaning different things to different people. Some critics often conflated the term broken windows with zero-tolerance policing, which, as best as I can tell, describes a strategy of meeting any and all infractions with a harsh enforcement response, which was something that Kelling adamantly rejected. Others would use broken windows coterminously with certain disfavored police tactics, such as Terry stops, better known as stop, question, and frisk, or pretextual stops, which were enforcement actions taken based on suspicion that more serious criminal conduct was afoot. Broken windows also became synonymous with proactive policing, an umbrella term that described efforts to head off more serious crime through increases in police-initiated activity, particularly in and around crime hotspots that were engaged in with an eye toward discovering and discouraging criminal conduct, such as illegal gun carrying and open-air drug dealing, things that were thought of as precursors of more serious crimes like armed robberies and shootings. But none of these notions were quite right, and I can tell you, having worked closely with him in the last chapter of his life, that George Kelling was incredibly frustrated by the mischaracterizations, or as he would say, bastardizations of his ideas. Broken windows did not mean zero tolerance. The theory did not assert that the default response to public disorder should be the most aggressive or punitive enforcement option available, nor did the theory prescribe a set of tactics that would or should define its integration into policing, though the authors did suggest that police executives should experiment with variations on the sort of foot patrol programs that the authors studied in Newark, New Jersey, which inspired the theory. Of course, the theory of broken windows may have informed various police tactics and deployment strategies, but it should be understood as what the scholars who posited it said it was. Nothing more, nothing less. And what they proffered in that famed 1982 essay was a theoretical contention that visible disorder in public spaces signals a lack of care and attention, one that encourages the law-abiding to avoid those spaces, rendering the informal reinforcement of social norms less likely to occur, thereby leaving those spaces more vulnerable to the kind of urban decay that characterized much of the decade in which the article was written, as well as the one that preceded it. But that reality has not and did not stop critics of the theory and of policing more broadly from mischaracterizing broken windows in order to serve their own agendas. One particularly frustrating example of this dates to 2018, when the New York chapter of the ACLU put together a pop-up museum on broken windows, which I, of course, visited. The museum featured a large and prominently placed piece of wall art that read, quote, "The NYPD has made more stops of young black men than there are young black men living in New York City." But here's the thing. The Broken Windows article, the article in which the theory was articulated, never mentioned stop and frisk. Not once. But no one who visited the museum would have been able to deduce that. It featured all manner of exhibits, but the museum's curators didn't see fit to include the original article anywhere in the building. Now, as crime continued its downward trajectory in cities throughout the country during the first decade of the 21st century, and as large urban police departments began to focus on developing their own counterterrorism capabilities in a post-9/11 world, the intensity of the debate about broken windows and the role that it may or may not have played in the great crime decline seemed to fade a bit during the late 2000s. But with crime, particularly gun violence, rising in recent years, and with a slew of viral police use of force incidents capturing the nation's attention in what could be dubbed the post-Ferguson era, debates about whether American police should return to their mid-1990s postures has begun to kick off anew. But whether police should readopt the more aggressive postures that characterized departments like the NYPD in the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s is a question that, in my view, puts the cart before the horse. It does so in that it fails to grapple with two massive barriers to anything approximating a return to the things that both supporters and critics of broken windows have used the term to refer to. It's as if the debate about whether something like broken windows is worth revisiting assumes that the only thing stopping departments from reintegrating theories like broken windows into their tactical and strategic decision-making is that they haven't yet decided whether they want to. But this assumption is unwarranted. The harsh truth is that in many American cities, having proactive cops walking foot patrols and taking the time to engage with those on their beats to learn about the social norms that prevail there and how to help enforce them is miles and miles away. In so much of the country, police are barely able to keep up with calls for service, to maintain compliance with new, more burdensome reporting requirements, and, in some places and cases, to even fully staff their shifts. Consider the following. According to the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, resignations were up nearly 50% in 2022 relative to 2019. Retirements were up almost 20%. And departments, by and large, have not been able to hire enough officers to replace those that are leaving. And even if departments were able to do so, they'd be replacing more experienced officers with less experienced officers. And as more departments lower or modify their hiring standards to boost recruitment, you can bet that at least some of those new officers will not only be less experienced, but also potentially less competent. What has this workforce crisis meant for police practice? One of my police sources in Chicago has been sending me snapshots of the assignment schedules for some of the districts in that city over the last few months. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. On July 20th, the 1530 to 0200 shift in the 5th District in Chicago should have had cars assigned to 8 different beats. There was only one car on the street for that shift. The 1730 to 0400 shift only had cars assigned to 4 of the 8 beats. On June 2nd, the 2100 to 0730 shift should have had cars assigned to 10 different beats. It could only staff 5 of them. For the 1530 to 0200 shift that same day, just 2 beats had cars. Now in New York, my home city, the staffing issues that have taken the NYPD of a force of more than 40,000 in the year 2000 to one of about 33,500 today have also driven up response times for all manner of calls for service. As I reported in the New York Post just a couple of weeks ago, the response times for critical, serious, and non-critical calls have risen 38%, 43%, and 52% respectively since October of 2019. It now takes nearly 10 minutes before an officer responds to a critical call for service. More than 27 minutes for an officer responds to a non-critical call. What might we expect that to do to the willingness of citizens to bother calling to report less urgent matters? Now, in addition to the capacity problem, police are also facing a crisis of morale. And that crisis has both contributed to the recruitment and retention issues, but it's also affected the way that officers engage their environments when they're on patrol, rendering them less proactive. In another perf survey of its members, many executives tied their recruitment and retention issues to the morale of their officers. In the open response portion of the survey administered 2 years ago, featured remarks such as the following, quote, "Officers are depressed over the negative national narrative about the police. There is considerable concern by my officers over the future of policing. Their significant others are pressuring them to leave the profession. The negative climate surrounding law enforcement has definitely affected our morale." And finally, quote, "Nearly every person in this department has had to change the way they conduct police work. The greatest casualty of this has been proactive work on the patrol level." The hit to proactive work is further evidenced by sharp declines in arrests, which between 2009 and 19 fell by 25% nationally. In many cities, this decline is especially pronounced for the sort of quality of life offenses that broken windows told us were worthy of police attention. A recent paper out of the American Enterprise Institute found that between 2013 and 2022, arrests for offenses like fare evasion, lewd behavior, vandalism, loitering, and public drinking and intoxication were down 74% in New York City, down 77% in Washington, D.C., and down 81% in Los Angeles. So, while it's worth having a debate about whether theories like broken windows or strategies like community policing, which is another deeply misunderstood term, and tactics like stop, question, and frisk can help get crime back under control in the places in which it has spiked, we must contend with the fact that the far more pressing issues that need to be tackled first are the recruitment, retention, and morale crises facing police departments across the country, because these are, in fact, existential threats. And that process, it must begin with an effort to understand what it is that's at the root of the workforce and morale crises facing policing. And from where I sit or stand, it's a good bet that these problems are driven in significant part by the widespread demonization of policing as an institution in the wake of incidents like the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as well as by the radical shifts in the policy environment that have so significantly raised the transaction costs of enforcing the law, while significantly lowering the transaction costs of breaking the law. And this widespread demonization and the policy levers that have been pulled as a result are part and parcel of a broader narrative about crime and justice here in the U.S., one that I think rests on three fundamental claims, each of which reflects major analytical errors. The first, that the U.S. has a mass incarceration problem. The second, that it has a police violence problem. And the third, that because both of these problems disproportionately impact low-income minority communities, what critics now call the criminal legal or penal system, because we are to believe that justice no longer exists here in the U.S., also has a systemic racism problem. I want to take a couple of minutes just to say something about each of these. With respect to mass incarceration, the logic of that critique presupposes a policy response, which is mass decarceration. In fact, if we have incarcerated en masse and that's a problem, we should decarcerate en masse. Well, then the best question to ask to assess whether in fact we have a mass incarceration problem is to see whether we can safely decarcerate en masse. Well, answering that question, which I think results in a conclusion of an emphatic no, just requires looking at some of the data. Who goes to prison? How long do they stay there? What are they there for? What do their criminal histories look like? And how likely are they to reoffend if released? Well, it turns out that if you look at the data on imprisonment in the U.S., what you find is that it's a relatively short-term sanction that's relatively rarely handed down. And it's reserved almost entirely for chronic and serious violent offenders who, by the way, are extremely likely to reoffend if released. So if you look at the data, what do you find? You find that only 40% of state felony convictions result in a post-conviction prison sentence. That's it, meaning that 60% of the time, someone who's convicted of a state felony will either serve a term of probation or be sentenced to time served in pretrial detention. Just 40%. When they do go to prison, they may be sentenced to very long terms, but the average amount of time served is just 16 months. Even if you disaggregate violent offenses and just focus on those, it's just 2.5 years. Now, that may seem like a lot to those of you in the room who are used to having their freedom, But when you consider the criminal histories and records of the people incarcerated in the United States, it doesn't make quite a lot of sense. What do I mean by that? The typical prisoner in the United States has between 10 and 12 prior arrests and between 5 and 6 prior convictions. That is completely and utterly incongruous with the narrative of denied second chances. We have Second Chance Month in the United States. And I ask people who celebrate that holiday, if we can call it that, who on earth in our prisons has been denied a second chance? Show them to me. Show me the first-time offender serving a 10-year sentence. Unless you can show me a serial killer or a heinous murderer, they're not there. They're not there. More than 60% of the prison population at the state level, which accounts for about 9 out of every 10 people incarcerated, are there primarily for a violent felony or a weapons felony. Only 14% are there primarily for drugs. Notice I say primarily. The reason for that is because those statistics are a function of the highest potential sentence that you might be serving, which means that if you are convicted of having a kilo of cocaine in your trunk and an illegal firearm on your waist, you will be categorized as a drug offender because the top line sentence, the sentence ceiling for the drug offense is higher. And of course, just because someone is serving time primarily for a nonviolent offense does not mean that they don't have violent offenses in their very lengthy criminal histories. I can guarantee you that a massive proportion of the people serving time for drug or other property offenses have significant violent felonies in somewhere in that 10 to 12 arrest history, somewhere in that 5 to 6 conviction history. And how likely are they to recidivate once they're released? Well, the Bureau of Justice Statistics tells us that over a 10-year period, we can expect anywhere between 80 and 83% of released state prisoners to be rearrested at least once. On average, over that 10-year period, they will be rearrested 5 times each, which of course is only a fraction of the criminal conduct that they actually engage in. How do we know that? Well, because we know 2 things about crime in this country. 1 is that the vast majority of it is not reported to police, and 2, that the vast majority of the crimes that are reported to police do not result in a clearance. They don't result in an arrest. The vast majority of the crimes that we track, including the most serious offenses, except for murder, and even that has been dropping significantly in recent years, does not result in any accountability. So when you look at the recidivism statistics, understand that it's only capturing a tiny share of the actual criminal conduct being engaged in. What about the police violence problem? Right? We're all supposed to look at viral police incidents, which in fact are terrible, and understand that this is characteristic of American policing. It's not. I looked at data from 2018 from 50 different police departments in this country on police shootings. And I was able to deduce from that police fired their weapons that year in this entire country somewhere around 3,000 times. Which sounds like a lot. It's about 8 shootings a day. But in a country of 330 million people, with 680 some odd thousand full-time uniform officers making more than 10.3 million arrests and having 75 plus million contacts with members of the public over the age of 16, what you get from that is a deadly force rate of just 0.03% of all arrests. Does that sound like a police violence problem? Well, you might say, well, that's just fatal police force. What about less serious kinds of force? Well, we have a study from 2018 that looked at mid-sized police departments in Arizona, Louisiana, and North Carolina over a 2-year period. Over that period, those departments collectively fielded over 1 million calls for service. They made over 114,000 criminal arrests. In that entire data set, there's just 1 fatal police shooting. And police use force of any kind in just 1 out of every 128 of the arrests, meaning that more than 99% of the time, in those places, police officers didn't use any force whatsoever. And in 98% of the cases in which force was used, there was either no injury or a mild injury to the suspect. Now that seems to be the low end of the spectrum. If you look at the NYPD, in 2021, they fielded 6.4 million calls for service, made over 166,000 arrests. They used force in 3% of those arrests. 94% of those uses of force were level 1 uses of force, which is just simply putting their hands on a suspect. Again, that does not sound like a police violence problem. This is not to say the police are perfect. This is not to say that they don't make mistakes. This is not to say that some cops don't act maliciously. And this is not to say that the accountability measures that are put in place are batting 1,000 when police officers misbehave. But if we're going to understand a problem from a public policy standpoint, we have to be honest about it. We have to be honest about its scope and its implications. Now, again, we're told that both mass incarceration and police violence disproportionately impacts low-income minority communities, such that this is proof positive that we have a systemic racism problem in criminal justice here in the United States. Now, my biggest beef with that particular line of critique is that it looks only at one side of the ledger. It pretends as if enforcement is the only byproduct of policing and criminal justice. We're told to understand that a black male in the United States is 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white male. We're told that black males make up almost 24% of people on the receiving end of deadly force by police, yet they're only 7% of the population. These are the disparities that we're supposed to focus on. But there are other outputs of the criminal justice system and of policing, the most important of them being crime declines. Every single study that's ever been done of any note consistently finds that when you invest in policing, when you hire more officers, when you expand patrol areas, when you increase proactivity, when you focus on hotspots, all of those things reduce crime. The only debate is about how much and to what degree. Same thing with incarceration. Very few honest scholars in this country will tell you that the buildup of incarceration over the course of the 1990s had zero effect on crime. The debate is really just about the degree to which it affected crime. You have William Spellman, who says it was 25% of the crime decline that could be attributed to incarceration. You have Stephen Levitt, who says it was more like 45%. Either way, it's a massive number. So then the question becomes, who benefited from those crime declines? I saw a really troubling graph that was published in the Wall Street Journal. It was taken from a paper that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association 2 years ago, looking at gun violence in the United States from 1990 to 2021. And it breaks down at one point the fatal gun violence victimization rate for males by race. And what you see on the graph is that the white male gun homicide rate is right along the bottom of the x-axis. It barely moves between 1990 and 2021. For Hispanic males, it starts at about 20 per 100,000, goes down to about half that, and starts to spike up a little bit right around 2015, 16, and then it jumps a decent amount in 2021, but still maintains most of the gains that were made over that period. For black males, it starts at nearly 60 per 100,000. It's a massive, very steep decline that holds itself for about 25 years. And by 2021, it had reached its 1990s peak. So when people tell you that crime isn't as bad as it used to be in the bad old days in the 1990s, they ask for who? Now, the reason I bring that up is because if you look at the crime decline that occurred between 1990 and 2014, specifically with respect to homicides, what do you find? You find that that decline added a full year of life expectancy to the average black man's life in this country. It only added 0.14 years of life expectancy to the average white man's life in this country. It's an 8x difference. So then the rhetorical question becomes, why on earth would a set of institutions that are allegedly designed and operated for the specific oppression of low-income minority communities so disproportionately benefit those communities when the system achieves its stated ends? As stated by whom? As stated by the people at the system's helm. Ask any police chief, any law and order DA, how do you define success? What are you trying to accomplish? Well, we want to control crime. Well, we know enough about crime control to know who stands to benefit the most from it. And it's not high-income, white communities. That's not the reality. And so, when you consider breathing life back into the institution of policing, you have to understand that that's going to require a successful campaign to take on these ideas, the ones undergirding the oppositional attitude toward policing and other institutions of criminal justice that have infected so many state and local legislatures, as well as the federal government, because those are the ideas that have made the political and policy environments in which police operate so inhospitable. And this is not a small task. It's not. It's going to require courage. It's going to require bold thinking. And it's going to require an intimate knowledge of and empathy for the ugly realities of life in our country's most dangerous neighborhoods. In other words, it's going to require us to tap into our inner James Q. Wilsons and George L. Kellings. Thank you very much. So we've got some time for Q&A. We've already got a hand up, so I don't know if there's a microphone, but just project and...
Hi, everybody. I'm not a policing expert. I am just a regular taxpayer and a public safety concerned person. I just want to see by show of hands if there's anybody here from the LAPD or from the Sheriff's Department or the Mayor's Office or City Council. How about the Superior Court? Yay! We'll take that. Okay, that's wonderful. Question number 2. You have presented an amazing summary, and the crisis is actually probably a poly-crisis with so many variables. The baby boomers have retired, and there is a fight for talent in just about every profession in this country. The understaffing of the police department is a huge issue. Where are you going to get these people from?
So I think the answer to the question is from the same place that we always got them from. There is not a shortage of civic-minded people in this country, people who care about their communities. There is a shortage of civic-minded people who care about their communities, who are willing to put themselves on the proverbial chopping block, who are willing to take a job in which it is all but guaranteed that if they make a mistake in the field, they will not get the benefit of the doubt, in which making a sincere and earnest mistake may mean being on the receiving end of a criminal prosecution, of a debilitating lawsuit, and having to go through all of that without the support of your department, of your city, of the citizenry. I took the LSAT before I went to law school in June of 2010. A week after that, I took the NYPD exam. And if you know anything about the NYPD exam, you take it in a big cohort with tens and thousands of other people. And I don't know how many people were in my cohort, but you get a list number based on your score. And I was fortunate enough to get a perfect score. My list number was 1. And I went home. My father's an NYPD veteran, was a detective for more than 20 years. And I said, "Hey, Dad, you'll never guess what." What? And I handed him the piece of paper. And I watched his smile turn into a frown and a face of anger. And I said, "What's wrong? Can't you see, like, my list number's 1. Wasn't yours like 14,000? You should be proud." And he said, "Why are you doing this?" He retired in 2004. He threatened to never talk to me again if I became a cop. Rather than being flattered that his son was considering following in his footsteps, he put more energy into talking me out of that profession than I have ever seen him put into talking me out or into anything ever in the course of my life. And eventually he won. I went to law school. I'm not the only person who's had that experience. That's what needs to change. It's not that there's a shortage of a talent pool. There's a shortage of a talent pool that's willing to take an increasingly greater risk with their lives and their livelihood. If you have a family, I mean, the story my dad would say, the hypothetical he would give, you say, okay, you become a cop, you think you're going to save the world. All right, let's say 8 years into it, you've acquired skills that don't transfer into any other line of work. And now you end up in a fight with a suspect, you crack him over the head, somebody films it. This is very precious. 2010, he's saying this. And now you're on the front page in the New York Post, the department throws you under the bus, you're getting sued, you're getting prosecuted. Now what? You lose your pension. I didn't have an answer for him. That's what needs to change. There needs to be a belief that policing is noble. Who wants to join? Everyone wants to be a hero. But who wants to join a force that everyone tells you is a force for the negative? Is an oppressor, is an occupier? That's what really needs to change. Judge.
I'm Judge Deborah Archuleta, and I spoke with Mr. Mangual. Yes, I have his book. It's an excellent read. I got it autographed. I can't recommend it enough. I spoke with you. I'm running for district attorney for LA County to unseat Mr. Gascon. The question I have to you is this. How do we stop the progressive left from controlling the narrative? Because I'm going to a lot of events since I just launched my campaign a couple of weeks ago. And I need to know what I can do when I'm going out and talking to a variety of groups with different political perspectives. how I can sort of wrestle away some of the arguments from the progressive left on some of the various issues that you've discussed today, the mass incarceration, the police abuses and violence. Because I can spout statistics, I've read your book, I'm very familiar with broken windows, I was in the DA's office 26 years and now I'm a judge. But I have to be able to communicate that to the average uninformed voter. So if you have any suggestions on that, or anybody in this room has any suggestions, I would certainly be willing to take some notes on that, because that's the message that needs to be communicated. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I think the best piece of advice I can give you is to challenge them and meet them where they are on the issue that carries the most rhetorical force for them, and that's racial disparities. There is no way around that. That is by far the single most powerful thing that progressive critics of the criminal justice system can lean into. But we can't allow them to have a monopoly of empathy and care for minority communities. They don't. If you think about crime in this country, it's very hyper-concentrated. Very, very hyper-concentrated. The vast majority of us are very fortunate in that we live in places with murder rates close to zero. But if you look at, say, a city like Chicago, you take the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in that city, what you're going to find is a collection of places with a homicide rate in excess of 60 per 100,000. That's 2019 data. I'm sure it's changed since then. But in 2019, the national homicide rate was 5 per 100,000. And if you looked at the 10 safest neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, it was less than 2 per 100,000. It's a massive disparity. Now, the 10 most dangerous neighborhoods are more than 95% Black or Latino. More than 95%. The most dangerous neighborhood in that city that year was a place called West Garfield Park. Homicide rate of 131 per 100,000. Now, for context, 131 per 100,000 exceeds the violent death rate faced by any one of the frontline Marines fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan at the height of those conflicts. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a mother in 2003 sending her 19-year-old off to join the Marines, knowing that there's a good chance he's going to go to war. And imagine the fear that you would feel in that moment. Now understand that there are mothers in the United States today at a time of peace taking the same chance with their son's life by sending him to high school. That's the story that we need to respond to the progressive left with. We care too. Don't let them take that ground. Don't let them convince you that they're the only ones who speak for the interests of low-income minority communities. That's nonsense. Policing has done so much for those communities. What happened over the course of the 1990s was a miracle, the single most important and greatest achievement in urban American history. And it benefited precisely the communities that they say they speak exclusively for. It's nonsense.
Well, they like to take the moral high ground.
They do.
And then they like to throw the R word.
Well, you have to meet them there and you can't be scared of it.
I've been associated with the broken windows theory since chief of that, and worked in what I've been told is the worst crime neighborhood in the United States, Nickerson Gardens. We have a nonprofit there that was started by the cops and helped by business. I think our police are really guilty of two sins. One is character, and the other one is marketing. If you know what community policing is doing in the worst neighborhood in LA for certain, it's not one of the worst in the country. And it doesn't get marketed because the police they're just not going to take the time to brag about what they're doing. But it started 10 years ago through the good works of the police, and it was 17 graduates from high school with a 3.0 also graduated from college.
That's great.
In the top of their class. Now it's up to 171 this year.
It's awesome.
It's certainly a little bit of work and money from the private sector. It's a lot of work, most of all on their free time, with mentorship programs. It started because what people don't realize is gangs are very, very good business people. And they would shoot out the lights and shoot off gunfire between 5:30 and 7 in the morning. So kids and their parents didn't want to go to school. Well, by third grade, they're a perfect recruit for the gang. And this community policing department in LA, who has been hassled by everybody from the the illustrious district attorney to
The current district attorney.
the current.
We'll leave it
district
at that.
attorney, Yeah, we'll leave it at that. To some council members, just keep their head down, keep doing their work, but their work is not publicized.
Yeah.
It would seem to me, and I really value your opinion, if there was a balance between the extreme left and the right, what cops really are having an effect on, not, like you said, not with just arrests,
Sure.
but changing the circumstances that these minority kids grow into. It seems like there would be some level of equalization to what's covered. You know, the left does a great social media. When's the last time, no offense to my chief who's right here in Thousand Oaks, when's the last time the police had any significant social media program that talked about what they do?
Yeah.
They don't.
No, I think you're exactly
I
right.
don't know if they even have time for it with less staff, but do you feel if we focused on that and we put some of our money towards that, it would make enough of a difference to crack through the net?
Absolutely. I mean, I've been touring the country for the last year, giving book talks, and a lot of the groups that I've been speaking to have been, sheriff's associations and prosecutors associations, and I like to end those speeches with sort of a set of recommendations. And one of the things that I always tell people in the room is that you cannot forfeit the PR fight. You can't. It's very common for people in public service to just think about their jobs as jobs, right? I'm here to fight crime. I'm a crime fighter. That's what I do. I put my head down. I go to work every day. I make the arrests. I prosecute the cases, etc. That's not enough anymore. The reality is that there are very well-funded, very energetic people who are working day and night to discredit the institutions that many of the people in this room represent. And they're not going to stop. So the question isn't whether or not you should have the PR fight. You're in the fight whether you like it or not. The only question is whether you're going to win. And that's going to take two things, in my opinion. One is a willingness to engage. And that's going to mean changing the paradigm. It's just different. Policing is not what it was in the 80s and 90s. It's not just a street-level job. You do have to be a PR master. You do have to hire those kinds of people. But it's also going to take data transparency, and this is a big point of frustration for me, and I'm not just speaking selfishly as a researcher, but I cannot tell you how difficult it is to get data from police departments, even though I am very police-friendly, right? It's, one of the things I like to do in different cities around the country is I go and I try to find just some basic information. For example, how many homicides are committed by people on parole? What share are committed by people on probation? What's the average number of prior arrests for someone convicted of a violent felony? I have no clue. I can't tell you that. I looked for here, couldn't find it for LA, couldn't find it for Malibu, couldn't find it for San Diego. That should be public. You need to make the data available that's going to allow people who are predisposed to defend your institutions to make a real case. And you're going to have to get used to the idea that putting data out means that it will be misused by people who don't like you, but they're going to do that anyway. And you have to invest in people who are capable and can make that case for you.
Sorry to interrupt, but I guess what he had to say reminded me of an interesting point. We are close to Hollywood, and people love, or used to love, cop shows and detective shows. And if we were able to incorporate these issues from our point of view into popular cop shows and detective shows, we might have a good chance of turning the public viewpoint around. But where are the cop shows these days?
So there are a couple things I want to say to that, because I think it's an important distinction. I think by and large, the public is on our side. I think if you ask the median American how they feel about the institution of policing, you find that they report a high degree of trust, even still. Even in the black community, Gallup did a poll in 2021. 81% of black respondents said they wanted as much, if not more, policing than they were currently getting. It's not so much that the broader public needs to be convinced of the utility of policing. It's that we have to change the minds of, or at least overcome the barrier presented by the people in elite institutions that have a disparate impact on the public debate, that have a disparate impact on public policy outcomes. Unfortunately, we don't get to survey, the entire, William F. Buckley, who I've always been an admirer of, he said something very funny and droll once, which was that I'd much sooner rather have the first 425 names in the Boston phone book run the country than, the faculty of Harvard. And what he was really getting at there was about that disconnect between the sort of general populace and people in elite circles. But the reality is that it's the editorial boards of the, Washington Post and New York Times and NPR. It's, the producers on MSNBC and CNN. It's the elite PhD graduates working on the Hill in policy development offices. It's academia, it's academic institutions. Those are the people that are really driving the outcomes, even if they don't represent the majority of Americans' viewpoints. And, so I do think that there's a lot of value in the kind of, police shows, things like Blue Bloods, which I used to be a big fan of, although I admit I don't have much time for TV anymore, or, NYPD Blue back in the day. And maybe that can help at the margins, but I think our problem is the group of people that would view a show like that as, they'd say, problematic, right? And I don't think that's the venue for changing their minds. I think we just have to have a real pugilistic effort to reclaim some territory in those places. There's no reason why the New York Times shouldn't be publishing more skeptical views of reform, more critical views of the progressive line. But we have to make enough noise for them to stop ignoring you.
I love your idea about transparency of data, because that certainly is a weapon,
Yeah.
to be used in a constructive way. But I remember reading that article in 1982. I was a big news hound. Most of those magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, I don't even look at anymore, because there is an issue with the lack of journalism now.
Yeah.
And the lack of facts, and sort of the hijacking of the truth. So I think, this issue is contained within the larger news or lack of news environment. And it really is hard for citizens to get their heads around what the truth is. I agree with you. I think the majority are on the police side, but I think we have to find other ways of communication. There are a lot of citizen journalists that are standing
Sure.
up. I really think a new news environment has to happen. I mean, with the high-tech, Google and so on, the ecosystem of local news feeding into, mid-city news, large city news, all of that's collapsed. So you have a very controlled news environment, which is dangerous for our country, and this is just one symptom of it. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that the sort of traditional information sharing dynamics are really being upended now. I mean, I think we're seeing the legacy media on its way out. I don't think the traditional sort of cable news networks and newspapers are going to be driving the agenda in the same way. But I'm not sure that what replaces that is necessarily going to be a better thing. I mean, I do think you're seeing a lot more independent news sources, Substacks and blogs, and podcasts have certainly become just way more popular than they were even just 10 years ago. But what that allows also is for people to curate their information sources in a way that cuts them off from alternative points of view. I think there's value in heterodoxy. And the direction that we're moving with respect to information dissemination is kind of away from that. We're moving in a direction in which people are more able now to confirm their biases by curating the podcasts that they take in or the Substacks that they read. And so I think that's going to prove to be a different and new challenge that I'm not sure will lead to better results. I think we got time for one more question. So, yes, gentleman here in the middle.
To what extent do the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs regimes that have been imposed by most municipal governments on all public employees,
Yeah.
including police, to what extent is this contributing to a lack of retention, really reduced morale from within.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say empirically. I don't know that there's been any rigorous research trying to assess the effect of that on various outcomes, but I would imagine that, it does undermine the trust among the rank and file for their departments. I mean, I think it's, when people hear DEI, they understand it as a signaling device, right? They understand it as, okay, this is a set of progressive orthodoxies that, that I probably don't agree with if I'm your sort of typical rank and file police officer. So they, grit their teeth and put up with it. But I think that puts distance between themselves and their institution. I think it builds distrust, right? Is this something that is just checking a box? Does my chief believe this? What does that mean for me? Am I going to have support or not? That's what matters. And so, I think personally the DEI infrastructure and the narrative that it's built around is toxic. I think it's wrong. I don't like the idea of dividing people into neat little groups of oppressed and oppressor. I don't think that's a useful way to run a society or an institution. And frankly, I think it's wrong. I think it fails to appreciate the real diversity among any collection of human beings. And so, I hope it's something that is a temporary phenomenon, and that we learn from the drastic mistake that we're making with it. But I don't hold a lot of confidence about that either.
Can I just get one?
Yes.
Could you just, as you wrap up here, you knew George Kelling. Could you just give us a couple of reflections on him?
He was an incredibly gracious person. So I met George Kelling pretty late in his life. I was relatively young in my tenure at the Manhattan Institute, and he was dealing with a lot of health issues, and he wanted to write one last piece on community policing and how it was so badly misunderstood. In fact, the title of the piece was "Community Policing Rightly Understood." That was, and he was very insistent on that title. And so the president of the Manhattan Institute said, hey, would you mind going up to New Hampshire and helping George Kelling with something? And I said, of course. Like, this guy was a hero. I read him for the first time when I was 18. It was, so I would, every so often, every couple of months, I would rent a car in New York City, and I would take a 5-hour drive up to New Hampshire, and I'd stay at a little hotel in Lebanon. In the morning, I'd go over and meet with him and Catherine, and we would have 5-6 hour discussions, and 90% of it was him just giving me an education on everything he thought, and then 10% was working on the thing that we were actually working on. But he was incredibly frustrated, I will say, with how much his work was mischaracterized. He really, really resented the accusation that he was a racist, that he had facilitated racism. I mean, the civil rights movement was a huge part of his life in the 60s and 70s. He was incredibly passionate about that cause. And I think that really hurt him. And, I don't think it's a coincidence that the last thing that he published before he passed was a clarifying piece. And I think that's a lesson for us to understand that, while people who are public intellectuals are responsible for the ideas that they put out into the ether, we too, as consumers of those ideas, are responsible to treat them honestly. Because we do an incredible amount of damage if we fail to do that. I'm not sure he quite ever got over that. But yeah, great man, intellectual giant, but also a sweetheart in every way. And I will always be grateful to him for the opportunity that he gave me, for the knowledge that he shared, for the time that he spent, for welcoming me into his home on so many occasions. I will always be greatly in his debt for that. Okay.
When's the next book coming out?
Soon. Thank you.